First and foremost, I want to say that Koe no Katachi is fantastic, and if you haven't seen it yet, I implore you to do so, as I'll be talking about some pretty major spoilers. It suffered at the hands of Kimi no Nawa, but more so due to availability than anything. Of course, Shinkai's work was great as well, but Koe no Katachi was able to leave a much longer lasting impression and connect with me on a much deeper level. I believe this is due to the fact that while Your Name is ultimately a great story, a silent voice takes great care in dealing with deeper issues that are pervasive throughout society today. Shoya and Shoko's situations are sadly commonplace, and one doesn't have to be depressed or have a disability to relate to their struggles. Throughout Naoko Yamada's work, she stresses the importance of letting the characters speak, or sign, for themselves. Part of the reason K-On! Is so engaging is because the viewer feels as if they've been given a special sneak peek into the characters' lives. Yui, Mio, Mugi, and Ritsu don't feel as if they live for the sake of the camera, rather we feel as though we're just constantly in the right places at the right times. This feeling transfers to her other projects, and especially Koe no Katachi. However, while K-On! So effortlessly captures the joy and transience of high school, Koe no Katachi instead fleshes out the complex issues of depression, bullying, and what it means to love oneself. The movie begins with a slow, melancholic look as Shoya goes through some ending preparations, before attempting to end his own life. Suicide is usually colored as something impulsive or spur of the moment, but in truth, like Shoya's case, the act is often premeditated. In a 2001 paper published in the Official Journal of American Association of Suicidology, they found that among 153 suicide attempters, only 24% acted impulsively. The shot leading up to the musical interlude is of Shoya ominously marking through a date on his calendar labeled Final Day. The sequence of events leading up to this moment only constitutes about a page of the manga, but the movie's depiction of Shoya methodically tying up all of his loose ends not only is true to reality, but instills the sense of discomfort as the viewer steadily comes to a realization of his intentions. As we take a trip to the past, we learn the source of Shoya's distress, and while his actions are deplorable, who I really want to talk to about is Kawai. Much of the sentiment towards her involves calling her fake, for pretty obvious reasons. She straight up ignores the quite obvious aggression going towards Shoko, and later champions herself as a paragon of innocence. However, when she adamantly defends herself against Shoya's very true allegations, I'm not quite sure she's faking. Bullying is an ongoing problem in Japan, with hundreds of cases being reported each year, and bullying in Japan is a different animal entirely when compared to the West, often involving entire classrooms against a single student, as well as complicit or apathetic teachers. What Kawai demonstrates is the power of the bystander effect and cognitive dissonance. You see, when we find ourselves in a situation where someone must act, but there are others around, people tend to just not do anything. This leads to horrible instances where murders happen in broad daylight, or where adorable deaf girls get picked on incessantly with no intervention. Some of the causes of the bystander effect include diffusion of responsibility. This isn't my problem to deal with, right? And social influence. After seeing Sahada's ostracization, conscious or not, it's human nature to avoid the same fate. Lastly, what makes Kawai so infuriating is that she seems unable to realize what she's done wrong. This is most likely cognitive dissonance at work. The human mind is not so great at handling inconsistencies, and oftentimes there are mental gymnastics that happen behind the scenes to make ourselves feel less uncomfortable with our actions. Kawai probably sees herself as a good person, and since bullying someone, directly or indirectly, isn't what a good person would do, she jumps through hoops to try to justify herself. This leads to her huge blow up at Shoya, because if he was the main one to bully Shoko, and she didn't do anything to hurt her directly, then she's absolved of all responsibility. Not actually, but that's the conclusion that her brain arrives at, all to validate her ignoring the terrible actions of her friends. Isn't psychology wonderful? When we see Shoko out of the flashback, she seems to be doing pretty well for herself. Her and Shoya's relationship is convalescent, and they only seem to grow closer as the movie goes on. It's due to this that the image of her climbing atop her balcony is so striking. It seemingly comes out of nowhere. But in retrospect, there's definitely some noticeable elements that influence her decision. Shoko, and to a lesser extent Shoya, exhibit signs of learned helplessness. The term refers to behavior that results when one is forced to endure inescapable, painful, or aversive stimuli. Eventually, when confronted with similar instances in the future, where there may be some form of escape, one instead just bears with it to the best of their ability. This is most evident with her interactions with Ueno, although I do admit that her behavior might also just be a combination of the language barrier and her own inherent non-confrontational nature. A running parallel between our two main characters is also self-blame. You can see Shoko constantly apologizing throughout the film, much to Ueno's chagrin, and Shoya lives with the burden of guilt he feels for his primary school days. Self-blame is an insidious thing that reframes stressful events as being the fault of our own. While Shoya feels awful for what he's done, Shoko seems to think it's her fault for simply existing. She obviously feels as if her disability only acts as a burden to others, but there are also moments where it prevents her from truly expressing herself. One can only imagine how trapped she must feel, and eventually she tries to escape through seemingly the only path available to her. Once again, this is a great parallel to Shoya's earlier attempt in the movie, because his decision seems to come about through similar reasons. Interestingly enough, Naoko Yamada says she took inspiration from the mathematical concept of limits when thinking of Shoko and Shoya's characters. The idea that two different values grow increasingly similar as they stretch towards infinity. Much of what we talked about so far is extremely heavy, but it's important to note that Koe no Katachi is not a tragedy, at least not in the literary sense. Naoko Yamada says that she sees A Silent Voice as a story about forgiveness at its core. She expands on this in the Koe no Katachi making book, saying, "We all have worries and many things that we feel guilt over, so we might lose the courage to love ourselves. Since I also have the melancholic part of myself, I wanted to make a film that ultimately said, it'll be okay." I think that while pretty much every character other than Shoko does some pretty appalling things, Koe no Katachi is careful to stress that there's more to people than past mistakes, and that it's possible to move forward. Almost every antagonistic character undergoes some kind of redemption, and ultimately the X's fall off and Shoya finds himself surrounded by the most unlikely of friends. Even Shoko's mom, who understandably held great animosity towards Shoya but was unreasonable in showing that animosity, ultimately pleads for forgiveness in one of the most courageous acts of humility. This position is referred to as dogeza and is a symbol of absolute submission. It's believed to have stemmed from medieval Japan, where exposing your neck to a potential blade was the ultimate act of fealty. In cultures across Asia, prostration is something you do in reverence to a deity, showing just how powerful of a message her and Yuzuru's action is. What I believe Koe no Katachi comes back to is this: you are not your mistakes, you are more than your misgivings, and you deserve your own happiness. If you or anyone you know is experiencing thoughts of suicide, please reach out. Here's the number to the suicide prevention hotline, but really talk to anyone, be it a friend or a family member. And of course, I'm not a psychologist, so if anything I said was wrong, I'm sorry. I must have stuttered.